Hi, everyone. My name is Gerard Sukram. I work for the Office of Youth Experiences at the University of South Florida. Today, we're hosting a webinar called Ask an Archaeologist, and we have a real archaeologist with us today, Dr. Laura Harrison. Dr. Harrison, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here. So my background is I've done archaeological field work throughout the United States as well as Europe, and I've done more extensive work on the Greek island of Crete for 3 years, and then also a couple of years over in Turkey. My background primarily focuses on the archaeology of early cities in the Bronze Age, which was a really interesting time of growing socio-political complexity where really people were living not only in sedentary places, but also developing social and political and economic hierarchies that differentiated themselves from one another. All of this within a really tightly knit community. So that's just a little bit about my background. I've done my graduate work at the University at Buffalo, undergraduate work in Ithaca, and I've been in Florida for about 10 years. I first came here to work as a postdoc at the University of South Florida, where I was for 2 years. And I worked in the field of digital heritage, which blends archaeology and advanced digital technologies. So early background studying the fundamentals of early complex societies, more recently using digital technologies to better understand the past, map the past, and also share it. So after 2 years as a postdoc at USF, I then went on to direct a virtual digital heritage lab there called Access 3D. And just recently, I've struck out on my own, and I now have my own consulting firm called Archeo Consulting, but I'm still partnering with USF and other colleagues in the area, including to do archaeological work. So that's just a little bit about my background. I'd also love to introduce my colleague, Kristin, who is also an archaeologist and an artist, and we got to know each other many years ago in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I'll pop in for a minute. As Laura said, we met in Turkey in 2014 at the archaeological site of Setimur. I also have a background in archaeology in Spain on the island of Minorca, which was a Roman age settlement. And I come to archaeology from the visual arts. So my background is in illustration and animation. I've spent most of my career working in children's entertainment, including cartoons and comics. And I'm really interested in how material culture tells the story of our human past and connects us past to present. And so I'm really excited to join my colleague Laura Harrison at the University of South Florida Youth Experiences summer camp program called Project Clay Camp, where we kind of use our experiences working in Bronze Age archaeology as a jumping off point to take you all on a journey back to the Bronze Age and to experiment with some of the craft techniques such as weaving and pottery making that people just like us practiced back in the Bronze Age.
So I was going to have Dr. Harrison tell you a little bit more about, oh, okay. Julian, I think actually we can give Blake the microphone for a second. We do have our first question from Blake. Blake, you can ask it in the Q&A or I can give you the microphone for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I think I did that right.
Yeah, Blake, if you'd like to ask the question, you can just unmute yourself, or you can place it in the Q&A, whichever you like. All right, we're gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
What like years was the Bronze Age? Was the Bronze Age? What
Blake, Blake, thank you for that question. So what's really interesting about the Bronze Age is that it happened in different times in different places. And so in Turkey, the area that I worked in, the Bronze Age was from about 3000 BC to 2000 BC. But if you go farther southeast into southern Iraq and Iran, it could be up to 1,000 years earlier than that, that the bronze technology that really defines the age first came into use. If you go to Northwestern Europe, you'll find that the Bronze Age was 1,000 years after it was in Turkey, approximately. And so it's really interesting how sort of different technological changes that defined the way people live their lives reach different places at different times. And of course, you see that throughout history, not just the Bronze Age, but it is interesting that it is you can only say when the Bronze Age happened if you also know where you're talking about. So in Greece and in Turkey and the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean particularly, we're looking at about 3000 to 2000 BC. And a lot of my work really focuses on the time period between 2200 and 2000 BC, which is what's called the late phase of the early Bronze Age. And that was one characterized by major climatic disruptions. There were bursts of urbanization where people came together, followed by pretty major collapses only a few centuries later. So a really dynamic period. And that is one of the things that really drew me to the Bronze Age. We're talking about, in this case, about 4,200 years before the present. Thank you for that question.
So Dr. Harrison, why don't you go through a couple of your slides and show them some of the research that you've done. And if anyone else has a question in the meantime, they can put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it in a couple of minutes.
Absolutely. So hopefully you all can see my screen right now. Is that true, Gerard?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
My mic was
Okay,
off. Yeah.
I just wanted to double check. Okay, so I have a couple of basic intro slides just to kind of give you a brief overview of some of the archaeology work that I've done. So what we're looking at here is the Bronze Age settlement of Setimur-Höyük, and this is in western central Turkey. It's about 6 hours by car from Istanbul. And this is the archaeological site that I led a project at in 2014 when I met Kristin, who's also on the call. And you can see some photos of us here with our field crew. This is one of the largest excavations in Turkey. So hundreds of workers congregated at this site for 6 months out of the year to do what's called a salvage excavation, which means that we're trying to excavate and find out as much as we can about the past before it's destroyed. The site happened to be located in a coal mine, and so it was important to do that salvage work. So you can see our really international team. I oversaw folks from 4 different countries. Some of them were Americans. And then we also worked alongside hundreds of local residents who participated in the excavation. And of course, this was a great opportunity for cultural exchange. You can see some cooking and stuff happening on the top right. My work also involved creating a 3D visualization of the site, which we'll get to. This is what the finished product looked like. So this is what an early city looked like in Turkey 4,200 years ago. Really simple street system leading through it. Domestic structures, and we see also early forms of craft specialization. We have weaving workshops depicted here. They're what's called like a part-time workshop. It'd be within someone's home. And we have things that are indicative of sort of personalization, where loom weights that are used to weigh down the vertical fibers in the loom have different decorations that we think may be connected not only to the type of weaving, but also to maybe certain families or certain workshops. So we can't ask the people back 4,200 years ago what it was like, but we can sort of peer beneath the surface and really understand a little bit about social networks that were happening at the time. And so you can see we found these things in domestic structures, as I say, the Bronze Age home office. So folks were doing some weaving part-time. They were also cooking, sleeping, and living in these structures. So this is a real site that Kristin and I excavated. Absolutely incredible preservation. You can still see these stone walls and all the different colors of the soil that tell us they were living floors, they're active spaces. They look completely different from just some, countryside. If you were to excavate like some area that humans hadn't lived in, you wouldn't see all those different colors in the soil that really get there through repeated use, burning, craft manufacture activity. In addition, here's some of the pottery that we find in the Bronze Age. This is the most common thing that you find at an archaeological site from the Bronze Age, even though you might think it would be bronze, but that's very rare. It's just for the elites, some of the folks running the settlement. Most people, day-to-day life, they're using pottery. So it's a lot of really beautiful handmade stuff here. This is before the potter's wheel was invented. In fact, it was just a couple hundred years before the potter's wheel. And so there were some really interesting innovations that were happening at the time regarding the use of molds to make pottery a little more efficiently.
Dr.
There's
Harrison, we
yeah,
have a couple of questions coming through.
sure.
Aiden actually asked before, have you ever discovered artifacts relating to ancient warfare? And he wants to know what warfare might have been like in the Bronze Age.
I would love to. Okay, so I stopped sharing my screen and here I am back. Yeah, so one of the things about the Bronze Age is it is the time when warfare became a little bit more prominent part of daily life. I have not personally excavated any sites that were connected to warfare, but I will say that Setimur Hayuk, even in the Bronze Age, was fortified. And so that is an indication of an interest in, I'll share my screen again, of an interest in protecting oneself from the outside world is having those walls. So you can see the digital reconstruction here. This is all based on real archaeology. And there are also a lot of bronze spears and weapons. Some of those were decorative. They weren't actually used, but they are found at this site and others like it in the Bronze Age. And you really go from these Neolithic farming villages that came before these urban centers. You're not seeing fortifications in these farming villages. It's only when people have lived there for several hundred or even 1,000 years, the social hierarchies start to develop, conflict increases, and then people feel the need to wall off their settlements. And they also invent bronze technology, which allows them to make weapons of war, which did not exist in the Neolithic. Great question.
The next question we have, even though your research is primarily in Turkey, is there anything that you can tell us about the Aztecs, maybe in the Bronze Age?
Great question. So the Bronze Age, the Aztecs didn't have a Bronze Age, interestingly. So the metallurgy in the New World is primarily gold and silver, which is natural. It's not alloyed the way that bronze is a combination of copper and tin. So you have a Bronze Age in China, you have it in Europe, you have it in Asia, but actually there was no Bronze Age for the Aztecs. But the Aztecs are still a very complex society. More complex, it's really an empire, which is a much larger and more integrated, complex type of social organization than Bronze Age Turkey, which is really almost a small village. Like it's much, much smaller. It's certainly not an empire. Folks were interconnected, but the Aztecs were, and this was sort of interesting about it is that they're a much more complex society, even though they didn't have bronze.
I'm going to pop in really fast and talk about maybe a couple of the similarities that we see across cultures, sort of around the world. And pottery that Dr. Harrison focused on a couple slides ago is really a common aspect in many cultures. So I think it's really interesting to compare what archaeologists are finding on different continents and from different civilizations and kind of see maybe the similarities in the way that humans live and how the material culture that they create sort of serves either very practical needs or maybe ceremonial purposes, decorative needs, and to kind of see like what commonalities and maybe what differences those imply.
Yeah, really interesting. And also echoing what Kristin said, it's fascinating if you take a global perspective at archaeology. And I'm not sure the exact dates, but pottery was independently invented multiple times in multiple cultures that were not in contact with one another at roughly around the same time. It is sort of connected with the agricultural revolution or the rise of agriculture. People had an increasing need to store wheat, grain, other liquids, things that they were, keeping in their houses. Because of course, once you have agriculture, you have fields that you're tending to, and you have to now stay by the fields. You're staying in one place, which increases the need for storage as compared to being a nomadic hunter-gatherer that's always moving around. Pottery is going to slow you down. It's going to weigh you down. It's very heavy. It's breakable. You need a kiln to make it. So those earlier settlements, they didn't really use pottery, but by the time people started growing crops, they were like, we're going to stay in one place. We need to organize this place and we're going to make pottery. And that happened all around the world at kind of a similar time in terms of like whenever agriculture showed up, so did pottery. So it's also fascinating to kind of look at that as a cross-cultural phenomenon. And there are some indications that it was the warming of the climate at the end of what's called the Younger Dryas that led to the proliferation of cereal grains growing around the world that didn't used to be there. And people eventually figured out how to cultivate wheat in many different places. And then the next thing you know, you have agriculture and permanent settlements.
We have a couple of questions. The first one is, what does a day in the life of an archaeologist look like? And kind of as a pair to that, what was your favorite excavation that you've ever done?
That's great. Kristin, do you want to take the first one about a day in the life of an archaeologist?
Yeah, I will pop in on this one. So at the archaeological excavation where Laura and I met in Turkey, there were several different areas of focus. So there was the actual excavation itself. So when we were in the trenches, we would usually show up in the early morning, like right after breakfast. We were there, and it was a live work site for Dr. Harrison and myself. So we just walked down the hill to the site, and then we would basically start in a trench with a trench team. So there's a trench master, an assistant trench master, who are sort of the bosses of our team, and they would assign us different sections, like quadrants, of a built structure, and we would observe the soil, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, like different dynamic colors and textures in the soil, and we would start with our trowels to slowly move soil, shift soil, and reveal anything. You never know what you're going to find. You may have suspicions, but it's so exciting when you do reveal maybe a fragment of pottery, a bit of charred wood, which is something amazing in this site. Through a site-wide fire, there was some wood preserved, which is incredible, and some seeds preserved. So we have some interesting information about how the structures stood and how the people lived with those grains and that agrarian community that Dr. Harrison just mentioned. There was also a really well situated documentation process on that site. As was mentioned, it was a salvage excavation, and the documentation was amazing. So there were photographs being taken. There were 3D models that were being created, similar to what Dr. Harrison showed in a previous slide. There was also an artifact illustration station, which I got to take part in. So I got to actually hold artifacts, and I got to draw pictures of them from every angle and really measure them and observe them and create a scientific documentation of them. Yep, there's some photos. That's me on the top right there, restoring a piece of pottery that was found on the site. And then we also had a chance to kind of move forward in our thinking and outreach to the community. And so that really is where our camp, Project Clay, was born, was wanting to share these stories and these experiences with all of you. So through this experience ourselves, we're sort of bringing you all into the Bronze Age and into a day of an archaeologist. Dr. Harrison, you might want to add to that through your experiences in archaeology as well.
No, I think it's a really good encapsulation. It really is. Typically, you get up early, you excavate for multiple hours, as Kristin described, looking for different changes in the soil, really being careful, doing your interpretation at the trowel's edge. You only get one chance to dig an archaeological site. You can't do it over. And so it's about precision, it's about patience, it's about honestly almost like a mindful approach where you're like really in it and you're trying to like sense like the different changes in soil, the artifacts. What does this mean? Am I inside the house or outside the house? And you go slow. And then once you're done with all of that and all the record keeping, typically in the afternoons and into the evenings is when you do supplementary work. You're doing pottery reconstruction, you're drawing, you're doing illustrating. There's a lot of pottery to clean with, some water and a toothbrush, and just documenting everything, working on the 3D scans and 3D models as well. And then also for the academics, writing everything up and synthesizing it. And then Gerard, I don't remember the second part of the question. Would you mind repeating that?
What was your favorite excavation?
I mean, of course, I would say Setamore because I wrote a whole dissertation about it and worked with Kristin and met Kristin there. But I also will say I spent 3 summers at the most magical archaeological site in Crete. It's called Gornia, and it is near Heraklion. For anyone who's ever been there, it's in eastern Crete, and it is also an early settlement, just like Setimore, but it's also right on the water, which, I mean, Setimore was within a coal mine. So in terms of like majestic landscapes, I mean, it does, I have to call out the Greece site just because of the incredible scenery, the mountains meeting the sea. Thinking about maritime archaeology and the history of seafaring in the Eastern Mediterranean. There was like an absolutely beautiful just promontory. So, of course, I loved that site as well. Setimore was much more rugged, I'll say that. But in terms of the archaeology, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, Crete sounds like more of a vacation to me. Were you actually working or were you just hanging out?
It's hard to say. I mean,
Yeah.
I will say that one of the things one of the things that really got me into archaeology to begin with, people actually ask me this question often. It's like, was it Indiana Jones? Actually, it was the traveling is really what sold me on it. It's quite expensive to take extended overseas trips around the world. And from a young age, I discovered that if you become an archaeologist, people will eventually like cover those expenses for you, depending on what kind of project that you're on, oftentimes,
So we
especially if you're
actually,
within academia. So that was a huge like a pull factor in me pursuing this career was I wanted to see the world and I didn't have the finances to self-fund, 3 summers in Greece. And it was like certain elements where, yeah, this kind of feels like a vacation. Look at this incredible scenery. I mean, you are working 10 hours a day, but it's also just an incredible life experience.
so we do have a question that's pretty related to that, actually. One person asked if they wanted to be an archaeologist in the future, what are the recommended courses or academic paths that they would take to become an archaeologist?
Great question. So in the United States, it's a little bit different than in Europe. So we'll do United States first. You need to get a degree in anthropology, which is the study of culture. In the United States, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology. So you can get a bachelor's degree in anthropology to become qualified as a field tech doing cultural resource management, which is contract archaeology. And you can move up a little higher if you get a master's degree. You can start running crews in contract archaeology, and you can do some academic archaeology as well. If you want to do the works and participate in writing up the reports and the academic articles and the books about archaeological sites, you're going to want to get a PhD also in anthropology. And what I did, which is you get a specialization in one of the 4 subfields. There's cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, or archaeology. Those are the 4 main subfields. I chose archaeology, so I have some base coursework and understanding of anthropology, but then I spent a lot of time learning the fundamentals of archaeology. So that is the pathway in the United States.
We had one more question and we only have 5 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure we got to this question. So earlier you were talking about the Bronze Age and somebody asked, I believe it was Blake who asked, when did the Bronze Age happen? And you said,
Yeah.
oh, it happened in different times for different places.
Yeah.
So someone else asked, did the Bronze Age travel or was it independent in these different areas?
Super interesting question. So unlike pottery, the Bronze Age, did it travel or did it emerge independently? I suppose it actually did emerge independently. Sorry, I was just thinking globally. Of course, I know more about the European and Asian context, but it did emerge, I think, independently in China. Basically, what's also interesting about the fact that it kind of emerged separately in a couple different places is that the metals that people used before bronze had some problems that bronze solved. So gold and silver, beautiful, decorative, not very strong. Copper is also a little bit more common, but it's not very strong. Tin, however, it's very uncommon, but people finally figured out through trade that if you add 10% tin to 90% copper, you get a really strong metal, which is bronze, and you can use that for weapons and all kinds of other things. So it took a lot of innovation and ingenuity for humans to figure this out and sort of alloy all these different metals. You can imagine all the different attempts that people made to like figure out, like, do you need 40% tin or just 10% tin? And that is innovation that did occur separately in Asia and in China.
I want to jump in really fast and just add to that. One of the slides that Dr. Harrison showed had a trade route that was kind of connecting over land and sea. And I think that's one of the coolest things about Settimorehoyuk, where we met, is that we really have some evidence of trade moving through the site and around the region. And so I think it's really cool to just be able to see that from the artifacts that we uncovered at the site, to have evidence of artifacts, objects that came over land and oversea from different locations. And you can kind of start to see the sharing of information, the sharing of maybe stylistic influence, and you can see how the people of the Bronze Age kind of communicated with each other through those trade routes.
Mm-hmm.
We do have time for one more question from Blake. So Blake, I'm gonna give you the microphone for a second.
Oh.
Have you ever discovered something like big that changed the way people think about things, how things were back then?
I suppose I can't think of like one specific thing per se. I've typically done my work on settlements and architecture. So the big thing I think I found out was how
Dr. Harrison, I think we lost your mic.
Oh, maybe while Dr. Harrison works it out, I'll jump in and say at our site, the team discovered molds, standardized shapes that the pottery was formed around, the clay was formed around. And that was an example of an early technology, like Dr. Harrison mentioned, before the invention of the pottery wheel and its usage in that region. And so it was really cool to discover, like, if you look in your kitchen and you see all of those bowls, your cereal bowls stacked, they're all like pretty much exactly the same size. Those are standardized shapes. And so that mold was like a brand new technology at the time in the region. And that was a super cool thing to discover at Settimorehoyuk.
No, sorry, Dr. Harrison, we still can't hear you. Might be the external microphone. In the meantime, Julian, do you have the flyer pulled up?
I'm just gonna place the webpage for archaeology and art in the chat. And so if you are liking what you're hearing and you want to learn a little bit more about the programs that we have, you can check out the webpage here. I'll put it in the chat in just a moment.
I love that. And I guess this is a good time to say that our upcoming archaeology and art camp at the University of South Florida in Tampa is happening from June 15th to the 19th, Monday through Friday. Dr. Harrison and I are going to be there, and we're super excited to meet you all. We're going to be actually digging, excavating an archaeological site in real life. We're so excited. And we're also going to travel back in time to the Bronze Age, and we are going to craft some pottery like we just saw today in the slides. And we're also going to do some weaving as the Bronze Age villagers did. And we're also going to have a chance to break into some comic illustrations and do some designs to 3D print our own maker's marks, like our friends in the Bronze Age used to identify what pottery and what products were theirs. So we're super excited to travel back in time with y'all, over 4,000 years back in time to the Bronze Age. So please do check out our summer camp, and we hope to meet you soon.
Thank you, Kristin. And hopefully you guys can hear me now as we wrap up. Okay, I switched audio.
Okay, so real quick before we go, Dr. Harrison, what's your favorite Indiana Jones movie?
Oh no, I'm not the right person for that question.
I will jump in and I will say
ahead,
the
Kristin.
first one. The first one is my favorite Indiana Jones movie. I am one of those movie buffs who did feel a little bit inspired as a young person watching Indiana Jones. And also, I just love adventure. I love travel. I love meeting new friends. And so travel for me too was a big part of what motivated me to get into archaeology.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, I think my favorite one is the one where he picks the cup at the end. I can't remember what that one's called. Yeah.
Is it the Holy Grail?
I think it's like the Holy Grail one. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not much of a movie buff myself. I'm so sorry.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Harrison, and thank you, Kristin, for answering everyone's questions and sharing a little bit more about what you do. Again, if you guys are interested and you are in middle school, then you can join us for Archaeology and Art this summer. We're so excited. It's our second year running it. And it was super fun last year. So we hope to see you this summer. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.